This is Essay 6 of this open Marxism book, The Disappearance of the Socialist System, Failure or Confirmation of Marx's Views on the Transition from One Form of Production in Society to Another by Maurice Godelier. And here he does an appraisal and analysis of socialism as it has existed historically, and what connection, if any, that this has to Marx's actual project, and if these systems fail, what that really means for Marxism. The disappearance of the socialist system. Failure or confirmation of Marx's view on the transition from one form of production in society to another, by Maurice Godelier. 1. The notions of process and period of transition. The expression period of transition is used to designate a particular phase in the evolution of a society, that phase in which a society encounters progressively greater internal and external difficulties in reproducing the economic and social relations on which it rests. Relations which give it both a functional logic and specific forms of evolution. At the same time, it is during this phase that new economic and social relations appear that will expand more or less quickly and more or less violently to become the conditions for the functioning of a new society. From this rough definition, we see immediately that periods of transition constitute moments of exceptional importance. They represent the moments at which the relations of production, modes of thought, and forms of individual or collective action come up against limits, whether intentional or external, and begin to crumble, to show cracks, to lose their social relevance, though they may in some cases stagnate in a lesser subordinate position for centuries before dying out of their own accord. Most often, however, their subordination and disappearance is accelerated through the action of social groups that desire the development of other means of thought, action, and production. To analyze the process and periods of transition, then, is to confront the pivotal moments of history, those moments in which, more clearly than at other times, history is created or summed up. On a theoretical level, such an analysis requires the mobilization of all social science disciplines, which in turn find themselves confronting the limits of their own capacities for interpreting history. Undoubtedly, when dealing with processes that begin or ended centuries ago, historians and their discipline are of primary importance. By contrast, when dealing with contemporary human social relations, each of the social sciences, economics, ethnology, sociology, demography, etc., is in a position to approach the task of analysis in its own manner. Yet, as soon as a statement of synthesis is to be attempted, none of these disciplines can be satisfied with its own resources. Each borrowed both hypotheses and results from the others. Ultimately, it is perhaps history which proves itself the least refined of all these disciplines, since its stated goal is only to offer synthesis of what we already know about societies that have succeeded one another in the past, and to provide an explanation for that chain of succession. To analyze the processes of transition means to attempt to evaluate the roles played respectively by chance and by necessity to account for the appearance and disappearance of the diverse social formulations that have succeeded one another over time. One has to assume that the nature of the social relations that exist within a society at a given time, and that impart to society an original functional logic, is not entirely accidental. That functional logic is present as much as in the conduct of the individuals and groups that make up that society, as in the effects, local or global, short-term or lasting, that these actions have on its reproduction. One cannot thus assume that, to a large degree, the functioning of societies creates systems. Such an analysis also presumes, however, that not everything in that evolution of society is necessary or predetermined, and hence that there are many ways of interpreting the events and problems which occur in that society. This indicates, moreover, that overall compatibility among the diverse social relations making up a society is only partial and provisional, that it does not exclude the existence either of contradictions within these relations or of conflicts of interest between the groups, the individuals that personify them. In short, in undertaking an analysis of the process of transition between societies of differing logic, the social sciences must confront problems analogous in a certain sense to those encountered by natural sciences. And they must attempt to account for the appearance of new structures and new forms of organization, whether living or inanimate. Scientific work must, of course, confront not only the objective limits of its instruments of analysis, but also the subjective effect of ideological overinvestment which this type of problem provokes in each of us. The evolution of life forms and the succession of societal forms. Do these possess a definable logic or sense? Is there only one way to understand them, or several, or perhaps none at all? And if they are comprehensible, when with reference to what mechanisms, contingent or recurrent? Despite the difficulties, researchers have continually undertaken this type of research. Since the beginning of the 19th century, we have been studying the origins of the capitalist mode of production and exchange, as well as the conditions that led to the primitive accumulation of capital. From Marx to Weber, the debate has continued, relaunched in 1946 with the publication of Dobbs' Studies in the Development of Capitalism, a book that gave rise to a vast international discussion, the essential contribution of which have been assembled in Hilton. Since 1979, 3 thick volumes by Brodel have been added to the discussion. Similar questions have long been posed concerning the lengthy period of transition from Greco-Roman antiquity to Middle Ages. Again, interpretations vary and works accumulate, from Gibbon's History of Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire to Anderson's Passages from Antiquity to Feudalism, by way of Dopsch, Weber, Rostovtsev, Jones, and of course Bloch, Dubé, and Finlay. But here, the difficulty seemed to magnify, since the transition to a feudal society also appears to have resulted from the coming together of 2 worlds, the Germanic and the Roman, and on the basis of still scarce sources, we have to evaluate the real role of the Germanic invasion in this process. A third, though not final, example brings us once again to historical periods and problems of a completely different nature, namely, to the example of research undertaken over the last few decades by archaeologists attempting to reconstruct the passage from the classless societies of the Neolithic era to the first forms of class-based or caste-based societies, and which seem to have been associated in the ancient Middle East, China, or America with certain forms of agricultural development and animal husbandry. The passage to socialism, a process condemned to fail? We have recently been witness to several phenomena: the general dissolution of the so-called socialist form of economy, and the government imposed in Central Europe after World War II by communist parties under the control of the USSR. The disappearance of socialism in the very country which gave birth to this type of regime after a revolution, which had been the source of so many hopes, and the ominous cracks in Mao's China, portends of equally great cataclysms to come in Asia. All these events show that we are living through one of those exceptional moments in which history leaves behind all the outdated ways of thinking, the dead and condemned forms of social organization. In short, there is an impression that we are living through the end of an epoch, the end of communism, and of course the end of the entire system of thought which set forth the principles of that age, the end of Marxism. Most striking of all is not the speed to which the main piece of the system collapsed one after another like a house of cards, but the system in fact lasted such a short time, 66 years at most. And nothing great, nothing even very important seems to survive it. Yet in the eyes of laudatory partisans and fierce enemies alike, this has been a colossus destined to last. Unlike Nazi totalitarianism, which was destroyed by military force, post-Stalin totalitarianism was predicted to have a long future yet, on the condition that it refrained from direct military attack on the capitalist camp. In addition, the failure of the Khrushchev-style reformers showed that it was equally impossible to reform this system from within, and hence was it not futile to desire it? The reforms failed, the colossus fell, it had in fact already decomposed, though no one knew it. In this sense, it was completely unlike the ancient slave society, which decomposed for centuries before disappearing fully. And even then, it left behind a legacy of ideas, artworks, and institutions which would serve once again in the development of the West, beginning in the 16th century. This transition could better be compared, and hence irony of ironies, we recall an example dear to Marx with the failure of the Carolingian reforms. There an attempt was made to revive the great estates of antiquity, and that at a time when the increase in the number of small and medium-sized holdings was directly responsible for advancements in agriculture. The example is somewhat inadequate, for Charlemagne's reforms had nothing in common with the ambitions of the Bolshevik Revolution, the founding of a classless democratic society. The circumstance that the system lasted such a short time and that its end was so quick suggests that unlike feudal, capitalist, or early archaic systems, it was not viable. It was not durable, and not because it violated human nature, as Christianity, Islam, and other prophetic religions would proclaim, but more simply because it had become far too divorced from the reality of our time. In the end, far from being the vanguard it had proclaimed itself at the head of the historical development of the age, it could not even follow them. Undoubtedly, though, such a system could not for a time be forcibly imposed on populations. Undoubtedly, though, such a system could for a time be forcibly imposed on populations who were supposedly awaiting the attainment of ideals inaccessible to capitalist bourgeois society: liberty, equality, and fraternity. Of course, the collapse of communism reflected back onto the system of thought which inspired it, that of Marx and those who professed to be Marxist. For a thinker who sought to uncover the laws of economic development in modern society, it was history that had the final say. Even if we were to close our eyes to the crimes committed in his name, Marx would remain a great, however utopian thinker, the last of the utopians. It would finally come, in the West at least, the time of the end of ideologies. In short, history would begin to recover its course and return to flow between the banks of the possible. That is, history is returning to a course which is none other than that of the capitalist development. Momentarily thwarted and set back by Russian Revolution and its sequels in Europe and the Third World, capitalist expansion now continues its inexorable forward march, faster and more vigorous than ever. Tomorrow, finally, Europe will be unified under capitalism's laws, from Atlantic to the Urals. It's expected to swallow China next, which will in turn be something altogether different from Russia. The end of communism, then, will be the end of Marxism, and at the same time, the triumph of capitalism and of liberalism. For many people, of whom I am one, who once fought simultaneously against capitalism and against the bureaucratic police regimes which had practiced terror and repression of the masses in the name of socialism, it is painful to report these facts. For what movements, what forms of struggle, what perspectives are to be invented today to struggle against exploitation, poverty, and the oppression and solitude to which human beings in their millions are subjected? And this not only in the countries of the Third World or Central Eastern Europe. Only recently, when the richest capitalist countries experienced a crisis, the tools of production and exchange were immediately and without hesitation or concern downsized, condemning millions of human beings, young and not so young, to unemployment. The triumph of capitalism entails its human cost. The problem remains, the contradictions change, but they do not disappear. Certain struggles stand out today, others will suggest themselves tomorrow. One must take part in them, but when doing so, we must avoid driving ourselves yet again into tragic and fruitless impasses. Perhaps never since the end of the 18th century have those who sought a just course of action had to face a balance sheet of such a terrible magnitude. At the same time, given this context, the future is far from clear, yet it is really the case that everything is as evident as it appears. To give but one example, it seems difficult to demonstrate that Marx's analysis contained the premises for the legitimation of the exploitation and submission of the popular masses by bureaucratic police states. In order to see this more clearly, we must analyze, among other things, the manner in which Marx presented the conditions and processes of the passage from one economic and social system to another, and particularly the passage from capitalism to what he can be called not socialism, but the mode of production of associate producers. The remainder of the capitalist chapter deals with this topic. On several occasions throughout his life, Marx posited the question, central to a scientific understanding of history, of the conditions and mechanisms of transition from one dominant mode of production to another, and from one economic and social formation to another. The texts are numerous and extend over his entire lifetime, from the German ideology of 1845 to 3 French drafts of his 1881 letter to the Russian revolutionary Vera Zasulich. She had asked him whether, in his opinion, Russia could make the transition to the mode of production of associate producers without passing through all the phases of capitalist production. We are now, a century later, dealing with the full significance of this question. The texts most important to our task are scattered through the sections of Capital dedicated to the transition in Europe from the feudal mode of production to the capitalist mode, as well as Marx's critique of the Gotha program, where he criticizes certain theses of the German Social Democrats with regards to the transition from capitalism to the mode of production of associate producers. We have then, on the one hand, analysis of the hypotheses about a transition which had already been completed in the leading Western countries. England, Holland, and France. At the time Marx was writing, and on the others, those texts in which Marx anticipates the passage to a mode of production of associate producers in the countries of developed capitalism. In the first case, we have a completed transition in capitalism governing the development of the economy and the society. In the second case, we have a transition that still remains to take place, but which according to Marx is already underway. How did Marx view the first transition, the one that was already completed and hence had succeeded? Marx saw it as a long-term process which had begun toward the end of the 15th century and was anticipated in Italy already in the 13th century and had not been completed in England until the beginning of the 19th century. Marx emphasized elsewhere that in history there was no clean breaks between different periods in a society's economic development or between diverse economic and social formations. Anticipated in Italy and begun again in Portugal and in Spain, this process actually came to a halt several times, only to start up again later in France and most importantly in Holland, until all the conditions which had existed elsewhere in a dispersed state came together at a given moment in England. In short, the process of transition is reduced to economic transformation, which brings about the dissolution and finally disappearance of a dominant mode of production and its replacement by another which will in turn dominate all the conditions of production and exchange. It is a process which, born spontaneously, develops in an unequal fashion in the different societies and takes several centuries to play itself out, first in one and then in another of the societies where it has developed. Marx's analysis limits themselves voluntarily to the study of the economic aspects of this process, yet he does not ignore transformation in the form of power. Ideas, Protestantism, and culture, painting, and music, which go hand in hand with these economic transformations. His analysis is reductive, but it is so by design. Marx proposed a periodization of this type of process, which he subdivided, albeit with a number of reservations, into three phases. 1. Birth, 2. Childhood and development of the new system, and 3. Maturity. The first two phases, birth and development, constitute the period of transition, which ends with the new modes of production achieving dominance, phase 3. Thus, the period of transition is also the period during which the old dominant system crumbles more or less rapidly and begins to disappear from one and then another of the diverse spheres of production, and this in one or several countries at the same time. According to Marx, we can locate the birth of the capitalist mode of production at the end of the 15th century, even before the discovery of America. Its childhood and development would extend from the end of the 16th to the middle of the 19th century, and its phases of maturity would have begun in England earlier than elsewhere. From the beginning of the 19th century, while France and Germany still lagged far behind. In the second half of the 19th century in England, with the appearance of cooperatives and worker-owned factories, and with the development of banks, trusts, and the like, Marx saw both direct, in the form of worker cooperatives, and indirect, diverse forms of socialized ownership of enterprises, signs that the transition to another, superior mode of production, the mode of production of the associate producers, had already begun, but only in the most developed capitalist countries. For Marx, clearly, socialism could come into being and find the conditions of its development only in the most developed capitalist countries where production and exchange are highly socialized, where the working class has a long history of struggle, and where it has been organizing for a long time already through trade unions and labor parties. Thus, when Mikhailovsky in 1877 or Socialist in 1881 asked the question, "Is this transition possible in Russia?" this response would be yes, but on several conditions. We will return to these, but one should be mentioned immediately: the Russian Revolution. If it breaks out, it will not do so at a time when capitalism is still intact, but when on the contrary it finds itself in Western Europe, as well as the United States, engaged in battle both with science, with the popular masses, and with the very productive forces which it engenders. In a word, a crisis that will end in its destruction, the return of the modern society to a higher form of the most archaic type, collective production and appropriation. Marx, 1881. This text contains echoes of an early remark by Engels. The possibility undeniably exists of raising this form of society to a higher one, without it being necessary for the Russian peasants to go through the intermediate stage of bourgeois small holdings. This, however, can only happen if, before the complete breakup of the communal ownership, a proletarian revolution is successfully carried out in Western Europe, creating for the Russian peasant the preconditions requisite for such a transition, particularly the material things he needs. In short, a revolution is possible in Russia, but only as an exception, and so on the conditions that a proletarian revolution erupts and triumphs at the same time in Western Europe. We know that what happened. After World War II, revolutionary uprisings broke out in Hungary and Germany. They were crushed. Since then, not one proletarian revolution has arisen in Europe. The exceptions have become the rule. In China, Vietnam, and Cuba, popular uprisings brought communist parties to power. These countries, the material and social conditions for passage to a model of production of associated producers did not exist. Countries like China and Vietnam possessed no more than a few small islands of capitalist industrial production. Let us return to the first moment of the transition period, the birth of the new social relations of production, and in particular to the birth of the capitalist relations of production. Marx writes on several occasions that this birth was spontaneous. It took place under the pressure of developing mercantile production, which was tied to the expansion of both international and national commerce in certain European countries from the 16th century onwards. The expansion of commerce, stimulated by feudal society, came up against the limits posed by feudal forms of organizing artisanal and industrial production and mercantile exchange. It confronted as obstacles the organization of production and commerce based on corporations and guilds. In Capital, Marx analyzes this spontaneous birth of the capitalist relations of production. He compares the capitalist workshop to that of the master artisan. He shows that the genesis of capitalism consisted of a new combination of the economic relations that were already in existence, but only after the elimination of control over production by corporations. Private ownership of the means of production, the use of money as capital, remuneration for work, whether in kind or in exchange for money, all existed. These elements would be retained and recombined, freeing up the potential for a new organization of production and transforming the workers, peasants, and apprentices into wage laborers, thereby bringing to an end their status as pseudo-members of the master artisan family. Briefly, three comments are in order if we want to compare this genesis with the birth of the socialist mode of production put in place after a political revolution. 1. The birth of the capitalist relations of production was spontaneous and sporadic before it appeared and became a converging phenomena in certain European countries. 2. This birth or genesis was a response to the development not of new productive forces, but rather of international and national mercantile exchange, as well as the production of a range of merchandise that fueled these changes. It was a transformation of the relations of production that took place in response to their own internal evolution, and not to some other type of pressure, that of new productive forces, for example. 3. This genesis appeared to be one possible way of organizing production outside corporative structures and against them, but in each case it was already existing economic relations, private property, use of money as capital, wage labor, etc., that found themselves combined in a new way, constituting a social form for the organization of production and exchange that was new and more efficient with regard to the economic needs of the then society. And of course, by directly combining capital and free labor, this formation contained all the elements of the exploitation of labor by capital, the modern form of exploitation of human labor by the owners of the means of production and finance. It contained the specific elements of capitalist class relations characteristic of modern post-feudal society. These new relations, once born, did not become dominant all at once in all branches of production and exchange as did the socialist relations of production. Rather, they developed sporadically here and there, ceased, disappeared, and reappeared. In brief, the second phase of the transition process, the childhood and development of the capitalist mode of production, took time and depended on many circumstances, economic or non-economic. Its development was not achieved solely on the basis of force, or of economic in the last instance. European colonial expansion wars, state aid, and expropriation of church properties, which facilitated agrarian reform and the redistribution of property. Protestantism and its ethic of work and health. Marx argues that all these circumstances and forces contributed to the development of the new relations of production. In large part, then, these relations owe their victory to various forms of violence, both public and private. Thus, the market is not and never was the unique source for the development of mercantile production. The latter existed, as Marx constantly reminds us, well before capitalism, and it relied at that time on entirely different relations of production in forms of labor exploitation, forms of slavery, indentured peasants, etc. Other forces than the market, then, aided or opposed the expansion of mercantile exchange. According to Marx, however, the decisive factor which assured the triumph of capitalism and established it as the new dominant mode of production, and this has definitely marked the evolution of modern Western societies, was its capacity to create its own material and intellectual base, developing machinery and big industry through the general application of scientific knowledge to production. The period of transition came to an end when capitalism ceased to rely on the technological and material base it had inherited from the feudal past and its manual trends. Capitalism became an economic reality where it began to create its own base and its own division of labor, destroying or abandoning the material conditions that had given rise to it. This is what Marx called the passage from the formal subsumption to the real subsumption of labor to capital. There are then not only new productive material and intellectual forces, science, technology, etc., but a new type of worker, the peace worker, who taken individually is deprived of all productive capacity, but who acquires it as soon as his labor power is combined with that of others within a collective structure. Thus, the capitalist mode of production became dominant where it constituted its own material base, where it destroyed or subordinated through competition the other forms and relations of production. Naturally, this stage was achieved only in those countries where the capitalist mode was most developed, those which constituted more or less the centers of its expansion relative to those of other countries at the diverse peripheries of this new economic ensemble. Thus, it is clear that for Marx, a proletarian revolution should erupt first in the most developed of the capitalist countries, in the center and at the periphery, as Russia was at the extreme edge of Europe. It is there in the center that this revolution had the greatest chance for success, not only immediate success, but in the form of a political victory, but also the possibility of actually being able to make the transition to modern and dynamic forms of social ownership of the means of production. After their political victory, the proletariat and its allies in the countries would have at their disposal all the concrete achievements of capitalism in such areas as the development of production, trade, the sciences, and technology. If we compare Marx's analysis concerning the conditions and possesses of the transition to capitalism, with what took place in Russia or in China, we see immediately that these were not developed capitalist countries, China less still by far than Tsarist Russia, and as a result, the revolution, as Marx and many others in this time had predicted, had to introduce technologies and productive forces developed in the capitalist West in order to create its own material base. It was therefore never truly able to compete with the most advanced capitalist countries. It was even less able to introduce into human history unique productive forces, both material and intellectual, heretofore unknown in the capitalist West, and which would in fact have to been inaccessible to the West because of the capitalist structures. This new formation was meant to create a material base upon which the society would develop that benefited the masses, something unattainable in a social system based on the exclusion of the vast majority from ownership and or control of the means of production and on the exploitation of their labor power. Very far from achieving this, the socialist bureaucratic police regimes grew old in a few decades without even managing to reach maturity. They were not durable because they were not viable, which returns us once again to our original questions. We are now able to take stock of the tragic illusion that lay behind Lenin's dance of joy on the day when it could be said that the Bolshevik Revolution had lasted as long as the Paris Commune. In contrast, Lenin and Trotsky harbored few illusions when they recognized that it would be difficult, if not impossible, to construct socialism in one country only. Should proletarian revolution not erupt and triumph swiftly in Western Europe and the United States, the countries at capitalism's center, the crushing of the Soviets of Budapest and Berlin taught them that they would still have to wait, and in the meantime, they would have to do what they could on their own to construct a mode of production for which even the material basis was lacking and for which the social form was yet to be invented. Essentially, when one analyzes what Marx thought of the role of political revolutions in England in 1645 and France in 1789, it is evident that for him, they did not bring into existence the capitalist mode of production. Certainly they accelerate its development, but not directly, for that was not their goal. Their goal was rather to transform the power relations, establishing a new sharing of power, first and foremost among the dominant social classes, including new and old aristocracies and diverse elements of the bourgeoisie. Oh, that's a really good insight. The Russian Revolution, in contrast, found itself confronting two tasks of unique in history. On the one hand, it had created a new mode of production, producing it from scratch, and imposing it on the entire society. This is already something unusual. Yet, on the other hand, this mode of production wanted to be the first in history, since the appearance of caste and class-based societies that did not rely on the exploitation of labor of the vast majority by minority, who owned and or controlled the means of production in existence. In short, this mode of production was to be humanity's first step beyond its prehistory. It was to become a form of production, superior capitalism, based on the communal appropriation of the means of production and the redistribution of the products of the labor to all. It would take into account both the labor provided by each individual and the needs of all members of society, productive and unproductive alike, with regards to health, education, transportation, and so on. And this first step beyond the prehistory of class societies was to be at the same time the starting point for the withering away of the state in the beginning of the reign of true liberty. In January 1874, 1 year before Marx drafted his critique of the Gotha program, Engels wrote these lines, which concur with Marx's own thinking. After the revolution, the state, while ceasing to serve a political function, will keep its administrative function and those of protecting the true interests of society. And Marx, commenting on decisions made by the Paris Commune, believed that the Commune was already no longer a state like the others. The idea then is clear. Society, which will reorganize production on the basis of a free and egalitarian association of producers, will put the whole machinery of the state where it will belong, into the Museum of Antiquities by the side of the spinning wheel and the bronze axe. Such is the conclusion of the origin of the family, private property, and the state. But that society could not be the Russia of 1971, exhausted as it was by war and or misery, where poverty, taxes, and debts continued to force millions of peasants to flee the countryside in search of a living working in the mines, the dock yards of Baku, or the cities. Even so, when Lenin drafted his notes on Marxism in the state at the height of the revolution in January-February 1917, he cited the text of Marx and Engels. Neither was this society of the China of 1949, a country overwhelmed by the devastation brought by the Japanese occupation and with the Kuomintang, and unable yet to gather its strength after the century of powerlessness that was the interminable agony of imperial China. But let us return once again to examine how Marx arrived at the conclusion that a revolution was possible in Russia and how he imagined the conditions for its success in the face of the task it would have to confront. We should recall that in his opinion, the Russian state was the most reactionary state in Europe, in that it combined the traits of the Western absolute monarchies with the centralizing and despotic characteristics one would encounter in states based on the exploitation of village communities, and those corresponding diverse forms which he called the Asiatic modes of production. According to Marx, it is this state, which had since the French Revolution played the role of the gendarme of Europe, called to the rescue each time a popular uprising threatened one or another state of Western or Central Europe. The principal productive force of Russia was still in his eyes the peasants and not the proletariat. A large portion of the land, especially lower quality land, was already the collective property of agricultural communes. At the great expense of the peasants and at the hothouse, as in a hothouse, the state forced entire branches of the Western capital system to grow in the form of banks, railways, joint stock companies, the stock market, the steam engine, and various mechanized industries. It wanted to make an interminable rural class of the more or less prosperous minority of the peasants and turn the majority into proletariat without mincing matters. Marx, 1881. The question then is whether Russia, following a peasant revolution and thanks to this unique combination of circumstances, could indeed make the transition directly to the economic system towards which modern society tends, without passing through the terrible vicissitude of capitalism, relying instead on pre-capitalist forms of ownership and collective labor. that still exist on a national scale in that country and are characteristic of the Russian agricultural commune. The conditions enumerated by Marx are worth citing. One should commence by placing the commune on a normal footing on its present basis, for the peasant is everywhere the enemy of any swift change. B. The agricultural commune in Russia occupies a unique position without precedent in history. Alone in Europe, it is still the predominant organic form of rural life throughout an immense empire. The common ownership of land provides it with the natural basis for the collective appropriation and its historical setting. Its contemporaneity with capitalist production lends it fully developed the material conditions for cooperative labor organized on a vast scale. It can thus incorporate the positive acquisitions devised by the capitalist system without passing through its caught-in forks. It can gradually replace parcel farming with the combined agriculture assisted by machines, which the physical lie of the land in Russia invites. In developing its base, communal ownership of the land, and eliminating the principle of private property, which it also implies it may become the direct starting point for the economic system towards which modern society tends, and turn over a new leaf without beginning by committing suicide. D. Russian society, which is no longer lived at the expense of the rural commune, owes it the first advances necessary for this change. E. There is one characteristic of the agricultural commune in Russia which afflicts it with weakness, hostile in every sense. That is, its isolation, which has caused a more or less centralized despotism to arise on top of the communes. Only in the midst of a general uprising could this isolation be broken. It would simply be necessary to replace the Volost, the government body, with an assembly of peasants elected by the commune themselves, serving as the economic and administrative organ for their interest. F. We should add as well that all of this will not suffice if in the Western countries a proletarian revolution is not successfully carried out, creating for the Russian peasant the preconditions necessary for such a transition, particularly the material things he needs, if only to carry through the revolution necessarily connected therewith of his whole agricultural system. When we examine this list of conditions that would permit an essentially peasant revolution to begin, in the same way as the supposedly imminent proletarian revolution were expected to begin in the most developed capitalist countries, a problem which Mao's China would also confront 60 years later, we are struck by the contrast, or indeed the opposition, between these conditions and what took place in Russia after the NEP. Marx in effect imagined that the revolution would be carried out by the peasants in association with all the powers of the Russian intelligentsia and to the benefit of the peasants. The changes further were to be gradual. The peasant would receive the means required for the development, the society owed it to them. They themselves would administer their affairs, economic and otherwise. The despotic and centralized state was to be reformed from head to toe, bureaucracy combated, and so on. There is no trace here of a Marx who would advocate state or bureaucratic terror against the working masses. This sheds light, moreover, on what he meant by the dictatorship of the proletariat, which was to be instituted for a certain time after the victory of the proletarian state. As an expert in ancient history, Marx knew that dictatorship was proclaimed in Rome when the temporary suspension of certain rights of the citizens became necessary to put an end to the civil wars which set them against one another. Thus, the dictatorship of the people was to be turned not against the people, but against the enemies of the people, against the representatives of the old exploiting class, who were opposing the revolutionary transformation of the society with arms or by other means. The dictatorship of the proletariat, then, was not that of a party, but of the majority of the people, the proletariat, and the other previously dominated classes against a minority. And this temporary regime, which was associated with the class conflicts that continue after a revolution, was to be succeeded by a democracy more rich in opportunities for the individual than that which the bourgeoisie had attained throughout its struggle. Marx's ironic stance against the formal and often illusory nature of bourgeois democracy and against the limits of a form of political freedom, which leaves intact servitude and economic inequalities, is well known. But this should not cause us to forget that when in his critique of the Gotha program, he sketched out with all prudence and reticence the form which the future communist society could take. He clearly affirmed that despite its narrowness, the bourgeois conception of rights, that is to say, a conception of rights which holds that all are equal before the law, would be indispensable until the higher phase of communism. Further, if we add all these texts, those in which Marx denounced the bureaucracy of modern states, which conceives of the state as its property, or which he criticized the barracks communism or state socialism advocated by Lassalle, ideas which he also saw set forth in the publication of the German Social Democrats in the years preceding his death, it is impossible to see in Marx the inspiration for, or the father of either Russian Stalinism or Maoism. Let us recall that he condemned with equal vigor the vulgar communism of those who were prepared to recommend that everything be shared. Engels went so far as to affirm in Anti-Düring that an attempt to abolish classes when the historical conditions do not yet exist would engender an overall step backwards in the society's development, a step backwards for civilization, or would give birth to utopian communities which will rapidly disappear of their own accord. Be that as it may, the conditions enumerated by Marx for the success of a socialist peasant revolution erupting in a country in which capitalism is not yet dominant contain a thesis which seems unrealistic, namely that the Russian society would give the peasants the material conditions they require for making the transformation possible. Engels even adds that a proletarian revolution in the West would offer to the Russian peasants the necessary material resources. But who would produce these resources? How would they be given by the Russian society or offered by the Western proletariat after the triumph of their own revolution? For here, we have precisely the problem of how the means of modernizing rural societies are to be accumulated, and it is in order to resolve this problem that Stalin's model of economic development for the USSR introduced the forced collectivization of agriculture production. That it placed an unconditional priority on developing the production of the means of production, and that imposed centralized and hence bureaucratic planning, the elimination of the market, and the mechanisms of competition, prices, and so on. In short, whatever ideas Marx and Engels may have had regarding an eventual revolution in Russia, and whatever were the attitudes, democratic or anti-democratic, of Lenin, Trotsky, and the Russian revolutionaries, once the revolution had taken place, the problem was there in its entirety. The question had become a reality. How does one develop a modern social society out of a rural society according to new principles while waiting for a proletarian revolution in the West to change the existing relations among states and provide the Russian peasants with the technical and economic resources they require? Finally, the question concerning the opposition between market and plan was posed for the new economic development of modern societies. We must remember how Marx conceived of those two terms, or two mechanisms, since it is with this idea that Russians and other revolutionaries confronted the task of developing a new economic logic and a new model of society. For Marx, the rationalization of production and its coordination and planning are traits of capitalist production that occur within a firm or a trust, a cartel, or an integrated group of capitalist enterprises. As a result of the separation of capital and labor, this rationality implies the existence of despotic forms of working discipline and a bureaucracy which is turned against the workers. Outside the enterprise, the market is characterized by competition and anarchy, or if monopolies dominate, by a form of regulation based not on the needs of the consumers, but on the maximum profit of the monopolies, which are able to speculate on the market that they control. According to Marx, socialism was to extend the internal rationality of enterprises to the whole of production with two fundamental changes. The enterprises would be self-managed by the producers themselves, and their production would be redirected first and foremost towards satisfying social needs, no longer guided by the principle of deriving from capital the maximum profit. A planned economy was supposed to allow one to both identify needs more precisely and satisfy them with the greatest speed and the least cost. For this, it was necessary that information on social needs be established and circulated on all levels and in all sectors, and that the entire process be self-managed by the associated producers themselves, controlling the conditions of production. Central planning was thus to be organically tied to the form of direct democracy, a democracy that was expanded to and active in all spheres: political, economic, social, and cultural. For Marx, then, a social society could only exist under the double condition that A, the producers are no longer cut off from real ownership and control over the management of the means of production, and B, as citizens, they are not separated from the political means of governing their society, and thus from the management of the state and the exercise of power. As a result, that state would begin to lose its old function as an instrument of domination and exploitation of the dominated classes and the laboring masses. The state would begin to wither away. With this vision of a type of democratic planning more capable of ensuring the economic development of society than the market had been, we are quite far from the bureaucratic police-style planning that actually oversaw the development of the socialist countries. It's not adding they also didn't really have planning to this degree anyways. They had a market and stuff. I mean, the US had more planning than the Soviet Union did during the space race. It's confined to certain industries. I mean, today, we're currently in the US right now doing a mass central planning operation, like with data centers. It's government state, it's literally state planning. Okay, to a higher degree than we saw in the Soviet Union, due to that, we have more technology to coordinate it. Anyways, we are quite far from the method that employed repression or intimidation precisely to eliminate any intervention by workers in the choice of objectives or methods of production, and that consecrated a part of the fruits of growth to improving the quality of life for a privileged nomenclatura, that's the name for the state planners, of state representatives, professional politicians, police, and other state and party functionaries who had a share in authority. It is this only because with Russia, China, Vietnam, and Romania, we had societies in which the capital structures were still too little developed, or as Weber argued in his short essay on socialism, is it the case that all planning on a national scale could only carry to the extreme the tendency of our age, towards the bureaucratization of production in society. Would it necessarily imply not the withering away, but the reinforcement of the state in its control over life of each individual, through the intermediary of a bureaucracy that is more powerful than ever, since it would finally unify industrial bureaucracy with that of the state? Weber's text is remarkable. It was written in 1918, a few months after the Russian Revolution had broken out, and that is before the revolutionaries had begun to construct a socialist economy and society. This was still the period of local Soviets and not of socialist states. Weber had been asked to represent a paper at a conference of officers and functionaries of the Prussian state in order to explain to them the significance of this socialism for which the Russian revolutionaries and their partisans in Germany and elsewhere were calling. Weber criticized as utopian the idea of a possible withering away of the state, and he made this critique not on the basis of data driven from concrete observation, but on the basis of a theoretical judgment on the destiny of the modern age, a constant and ineluctable drive towards the subordination of production and social life to bureaucratic and statist rationality. Socialism for Weber was certainly the passing away of capitalism, in the sense that it removed all obstacles to bureaucratization and statification of the social life still based on the private ownership of the means of production. A central planning that was democratic thus seemed to Weber logically and intrinsically contradictory, and hence impossible to achieve. He concluded with a statement on the necessity of a sort of Führerdemokratie to evoke the statist and bureaucratic menace. A singular expression, which others would later reinvent, but in order to associate with German National Socialism. We know what followed. And yet this debate, the opposition between market and central planning, remains a very real question today, not only in relation to the development of the underdeveloped countries, but within the most developed capitalist countries too, as they respond to those needs that cannot be addressed by the market in the logic of profit. Protection of the environment, improving the level of education and professional training, programs of research to combat deadly illness, and so on. Moreover, ideas about democratic control of the state or reappropriation by civil society of the functions concentrated in the state apparatus are playing a role in the struggles in political evolution of advanced capitalist countries with democratic parliamentary regimes. Why This is why today, taking into consideration what fascism and Stalinism have taught us, the struggle for the broadening of democracy constitutes the terrain of convergence and point of integration for all the struggles against inequality or denial of rights and liberties. Why are you living out, man? What's going on right now? For democracy cannot be reduced to its purely political dimensions, or politics simply to the right of citizens to vote once in 4 years to send their representatives to parliament. Political democracy is a real exercise and a sharing of the responsibilities for administering and governing society, and we are far from this even in the most advanced bourgeois democracies. But social and cultural democracy, the recognition of the difference between sexes, the recognition of the vested rights of immigrants who have been working for years in official blah 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 blah. Oh my god, why are you living out at the end of the paper? Finally, the last dimensions of democracy, the last domain which is still almost completely untouched, is that of economic democracy. I don't know, this guy's... I've never seen someone make such a great paper and then cliff dive at the end. It's like this guy once... What if we just did capitalism, but like we just voted on everything? Like, then that would be like socialism, right? I don't know. This is a joke. I don't know what the hell's going on right now. Yeah, so I want to read it. He's just battling economic democracy. In our time, the idea that a small uncontrolled minority should have its disposable means of society, yeah, we get it, okay. Illusory context of forced transition on which the strength of several revolutions and hopes for a more just society ultimately founder have been able to succeed. What can only be time of a pluralism? No, I'm done. Let me see. Marx needs to be reconsidered. We must know what we will keep of him and why. Yeah, I guess we do. In short, we're no longer approaching the future with the same materialism bequeathed to us by Marx, but this by no means renders obsolete his ideas that the forms of power and forms of economy are directly tied. That's like a very shallow takeaway. Okay, I've never had this happen before. Maybe it's a bit unprofessional to just not read the last few pages of paper, but it's like, the first part was so good when he's analyzing the Soviet Union, and like Charlotte doesn't really line with Marx, but then in the end it just kind of cliff dives and he starts talking about like pluralism and radical democracy and all this other nonsense and like equal rights and stuff, when it's like it's kind of missing the point in a pretty shallow view of this stuff. Like, did you know Marx actually saw like a connection between like political economy and like the politics and economy? Yes, I knew that. I think this is a pretty surface level takeaway. I don't know. Anyways, the paper's really, honestly, really good. My best one's in it. It's just to the end, he just falls off a cliff, living out over like radical democracy. But until that point, great paper. Great analysis. Bordiga has a better one. Just read Bordiga instead of half this stuff, to be honest. Academics don't read Bordiga, but 100 years ago, he basically did better versions of every fucking thesis they have now. Anyways, good paper.